Just when I started working on the topic for this sermon, a little boy and his mom at our church just waited to chat with me when the service was over. And as I was waiting and kind of saying bye to certain people, I realized they just sat there and were waiting, and they wanted to ask me this question. And the question the little boy asked me was that his grandmother had just passed away. And he wanted to ask Pastor Dom where his grandmother was and when he was going to see her again. And I realized what a beautiful, profound moment that was for that boy and that mom. And I also realized what a complicated moment that was for me whenever somebody asks you a question about what happens to people that we love when they die. The question that we're going to wrestle with today, and a question that I think so many of us at different times in our lives just can't shake, is what happens when we're just afraid of thinking or processing the fact that we're going to die. I mean, I've never actually done a talk on death and dying, and I don't know about you, but we live in a culture that is so overwhelmed with being positive and being healthy and feeling young that even the thought of wondering and dialoguing about this issue of death can feel so overwhelming. So I'm going to encourage you for the next few minutes to just stay with me and continue to kind of just think about the fact that this is a question that we just can't shake sometimes, and it matters how we think about death. It matters how we think about death because it points to our humanity, it points to our limitations, it points to the fact that we were created. And so one of the things we can't shake about death is that we're getting maybe older. And I think of so many people in my life that I care about. Whether you're young or old, whether you're like this young boy wondering about his grandmother, when we think about death, we also live in the space of grief. What does it mean to think about those that we've maybe lost, that we miss? And so I think that this is a question that we just can't shake because we were created to keep coming back to this intense issue about death and dying. And what does it mean that the world has all kinds of options and opinions about what death is and how we deal with it? And then Jesus in the Bible also invites us to think about this question from a different perspective. I don't know about you, but I have people in my life that when I think about just, the idea of dying or the idea of getting older, like the pendulum swings between people who are super positive. They never want to hear about anything negative. And then I have a whole group of other people in my life that I think they look at the world and they're like, everything is doom and gloom. It's almost like they want things to end because everything seems so broken. And so death sometimes can come almost in extremes. People like who just don't want to talk about it. And the fact that we live in a world where we feel like death is maybe just always in our news feed, always on our phone. And we're left with this question that maybe if we ignore it, or maybe if we pretend that we're feeling young and we're just kind of, feeling better about ourselves and eating healthy, we never have to talk about the D word. But it's a question we just can't shake. It's just there. Whether you're young or old, you approach the question and you wrestle with it in a very different way. I don't know if you know this, but recent studies, 2024, revealed that the whole industry of the anti-aging industry is $1 billion industry. That not only do we struggle with thinking about and talking about death, we don't even know what to deal with when we feel like we look like we're getting older and that we might die one day. The anti-aging industry is a reminder that we live in a time where this is not only a question we can't shake, but we're going to do everything we can and spend as much money as we can to maybe even pretend that we are going to look young, and maybe we're going to die, but we'll look young while we die. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there's something about eating healthy and some good products and, just being wise about sleep and health and what we eat that does help us really stay healthy. And that's a good thing. That honors God because we honor God with our bodies and how we live. But there is a danger of thinking that we can outrun this situation and not slow down and reflect on maybe some deeper things we need to learn when we think about this question of death and dying. And why thinking about it makes us afraid of the fact that we one day will die. All of us maybe at some point have wondered, I'm afraid when I get to the place where I hear news from the doctor that is just news that is horrifying news. Let me just say something that's so important, that if you're in the room, you're listening online, and you're in a season where you've gotten some news that is making you feel just so vulnerable to the pain and the reality of sickness and suffering and death, we want you to know that there's people in the room, leaders at the church, people you can reach out to that would love to journey with you in that space. Because none of us are meant to go through this alone, and there's a reason that we just can't shake this question. Because we're meant to live in this question in such a way to remember our frailty and to remember that we need one another in these moments. Now, there's this ancient prayer in the Bible, and it's an ancient prayer that's found in the Psalms. And it took me years to kind of read it and understand it. And I want to read it for you and talk about just some wisdom that comes from this prayer. And it says this. This is the prayer where, imagine this prayer. It says, God, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. It's this little kind of reminder in the Psalms that is a prayer about God, teach us to remember that we one day will not be here. To number our days is a very strange idea. To think about that we one day will die is something we avoid in our culture like the plague. But the ancient prayer that is given to us kind of in the Bible reminds us that as we number our days, as we pay attention to the reality of death and the inevitable reality that we were created by God with limitations, right, can come with a particular kind of wisdom. That to number our days can also have a certain wisdom to it. It's kind of the Bible's way of saying, like, don't think of death the way you see it in the world. Or don't think about this lingering question you just can't shake with the categories that you're given in culture where everything maybe is falling apart. But maybe approach it from a perspective where wisdom is available to you as you realize that you and I have days that are numbered, that our time on this earth is finite. And one of the beautiful points of wisdom that has helped me as I just think about this prayer is that it reminds me that I should be careful not to waste my energy or my thoughts or my worries on everything. Years ago, there was a book that was written called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And I think it's a simple way of saying, like, don't sweat the little things that distract you from other things that God is maybe calling you to do. Don't let the things that maybe are happening right now that feel like that the whole world is falling apart to remember that this too shall pass. Things we experience in the media, things maybe you're experiencing in your marriage, things you're dealing with at work that make you feel like this is all that's going on right now, that there's a perspective to say life is bigger than this, and I want my heart, my mind directed towards those things because my time on this earth is limited. Now, this is important because in our culture, just like in the biblical world, there's competing themes or competing ideas about what we do with death. There's all kinds of philosophies and ideas, and we live in a culture where technology now, and in a few minutes I'll share about how technology is pushing our understanding of death and how long we can live and what this means for the future of humanity. But in the biblical world, one of the competing narratives around this question about death and dying came from philosophers which were known as the Stoics. The Stoic philosophers were famous for being these wise teachers, and actually one of the emperors of Rome, he's one of the famous, often called the philosopher emperor because he wrote about Stoicism and he's written an amazing book that we still have called the Meditations. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and this is what he says about death. One day when he writes about this from a Stoic perspective, he says, don't look down on death, but welcome it. It's required by nature. The Stoics had this idea that death is just the way life goes. And so you know what? One of the best things to do with your life is to look at death and welcome it as something that is natural. We live and we die. It's interesting because I know people who look at life that way and in a sense kind of like that idea. I often encourage them to remember that there is something about death that maybe is not supposed to feel natural. Maybe death is supposed to bother us. Maybe there's something about death and dying that is supposed to rub us the wrong way. Maybe it's one of those questions that we are never supposed to shake. We're supposed to come back to it and ask God to give us new wisdom about this very important reality. See, Marcus Aurelius and all the Stoic philosophers were trying to make death something that was just natural. But I want to encourage you and I want to just maybe help you to understand that the people who were following Jesus and the people who were learning about the teachings of Jesus always were mindful that death doesn't feel natural. It feels like a violation of everything we love and everything we care about. That as much as you hear philosophers and teachings that say, hey, death is just the end of life and that's the way it happens and it sucks to be us, maybe it's not the whole picture. You know, in the ancient world, death was so unnatural and it was meant to be something that we never forget that is unnatural, that when people died, they actually buried people outside of a city. That when people were dying, not only was it unnatural to die and it felt like such a painful, grieving season in the life of a community or people, but it was something that they realized this is not the natural way the world was meant to be, and death is a violation of the good things that God has given to us. Like death feels like a disruption of the way things should be, because it is. death in some ways reminds us that the world is not the way God created it to be. And that we need God and his wisdom to remind us that although that death is still with us, it's not natural even though we think that it's natural. And so in the ancient world, what they did to remind themselves of this is they had rituals where people in the Bible, when somebody died, they buried them outside of the city. And actually, if you were a religious leader, you were prohibited from even touching or being near somebody who was dying. Part of that was just wise hygiene, right? That if you touch someone who was sick and was dying, you might get sick and contaminate the whole community. But part of it was a reminder that death should never feel natural. That it should always feel like something is wrong with death. And maybe every time we try to shake this question, the wisdom that God invites us into is to say maybe it should always bother us when we think of death or see death or feel that it's something that we're going to experience one day. It leads us to think about what it means to care, to help, to pray, to respond to injustice around the world. And so today, as we think about this in a more biblical way, I want to tell you this story, and it's a profound story that I come back to often. And it's found in John's gospel, and it has to do with Jesus entering a moment where people that he loves are experiencing grief and death. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that. It's one of the most awkward experiences of our lives. That no matter how much we love someone and no matter how much we prepare to be with somebody who's sick and is maybe breathing their last breath, there's something so awkward about knowing that they're gone. And we feel the grief of that. Maybe you're listening to this and you feel like a type of PTSD of a grief of having to say bye to someone that you love. Well, it's such good news to know that the Bible gives us stories where Jesus actually steps into these moments with people that he loves. We're told about two sisters. They're named Mary and Martha. And they know Jesus well, and they have a brother named Lazarus. The Bible tells us that Lazarus and Jesus are friends. He loves Lazarus, he loves Mary and Martha, and Lazarus is actually getting very, very sick. The Bible doesn't tell us what kind of sickness Lazarus has, but we know that Jesus is aware because servants are sent to Jesus to tell him that Lazarus is very, very sick, and kind of the request is that Jesus, would you come and make him better? And Mary and Martha, these two sisters, they reach out. We don't know if Jesus said, like, keep me updated on how Lazarus is doing. We don't know this. But at one point we know that as Jesus is being told about Lazarus' illness, that he actually delays and does not go to see him. This is such a shocking thing. I mean, if I loved someone and I cared about someone and I got an update of someone just in a hospital who was sick, I would rush there to go see them as fast as I could. I try to spend time with them and listen to them. And we know this. Sometimes we want to be with people that we love in those final moments. But Jesus delays in this story. He delays in some ways because I think he wants to bring to the surface these profound moments of wisdom that are available to us in our experiences of death and suffering. And to have a perspective on death and suffering that is a unique perspective for people who believe the things that Jesus was teaching. That at one point in the story, we find out that Jesus delays so much that Lazarus dies. It's shocking. In John chapter 11, you can read the whole story. And this is what we're told at one point. Jesus says to Martha, who runs out to see him, says, your brother, Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again, because Lazarus is gone now. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last days. This was a Jewish belief that at the end of time, people who have died will rise again. And Jesus said to her something so profound. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then Jesus says to Martha, do you believe this? I don't know if you've ever been to a funeral, been with people who are grieving. It's the worst time to try to teach them a lesson. That's why like preaching at a funeral or sharing in moments of grief in a hospital are so challenging. But Jesus decides in this moment to kind of provide such important teaching in a teachable moment that he's created. He's actually created a teachable moment by delaying going to see Lazarus and to begin this dialogue with Martha and soon with Mary about what it means when we experience death and when we wrestle with this question we just can't shake, and what it means that people who believe in him could have a different perspective on death. I don't know if you caught all the things that Jesus said, but what Jesus says to Martha is like, this is not just about that one day Lazarus will live again, like at the end of time. The Jewish teaching that at the end of time, the resurrection is available. Jesus actually uses the idea of resurrection and moves it back to the present. And he says there is a kind of resurrection strength that if you believe now because you believe in me, I am the resurrection and the life. And there's a resurrection way of life now that gives us a better perspective on death. The simple way you might have heard it in your life is that it means that when we die, we actually are just entering a new human existence in the life of the resurrection. Maybe if you're new to Christianity or new to faith, that's one of the simplest ways to understand it. That death in the Christian story with people who follow Jesus and people who believed Jesus, they started to realize that death is the beginning, is the end of something, but the beginning of something new, almost like a doorway. And that's why Christians throughout history have often said that death is almost like we're resting in peace until we're with Jesus and our loved ones again. Maybe that helps you. But what's more profound is that Jesus says to Martha that even those who are living now can begin to live in such a way where the resurrection is the primary way they see their lives, even when they're afraid of death itself. Man, I've needed this reminder so many times in my life when I'm with people who are sick or when I felt my body getting older, to know that the resurrection is not just a promise of something that happens to me later when I die, that following Jesus is not something I get serious about when I get older, but even now, whether you're a teenager or you're young or you feel healthy and you're fit, there's a resurrection perspective on life that Jesus wants us to have. And when we have that perspective, we don't ignore death, we don't minimize death, we don't pretend that death is just natural or we try to outrun it by feeling healthy, is that we realize that when death comes, there's something about the words of Jesus that will be with us that help us meet that moment, because the resurrection has been our lens our whole life. It's almost like life is the preparation to live in the resurrection promise of Jesus, so that when we have to deal with death, whether young or old, we're able to face it and not be afraid. That in some ways, the teachings of Jesus are that death is the thing that helps us to focus on who he is and not be afraid of all the things that are going to happen that are very much unknown. Then Jesus asks Martha this question: do you believe this? And in some ways, I think this morning, Jesus is asking you and me this question again. Like if you're watching online, maybe you're alone and you're still wrestling with this question of your health, suffering, a grieving parent. I think Jesus is asking you, do you believe that even in a moment of grief and dying, that there's a kind of resurrection perspective, that life is available to you now, that will prepare you and is able to make you the kind of person where you can be with other people when they're afraid of dying. This is one of the greatest gifts we give people who are afraid of death. And it's a question that I don't think we will ever shake. No matter how much anti-aging medication we use or how many times we try to get healthier, that there's something about our humanity where Jesus slows down enough to tell those he loves, do you believe that there's a kind of resurrection perspective that you can have even as you hold the mystery and the pain of death? Now, you feel all the tensions of the story, and you have Jesus and people who are there, they're mourning, and Martha. And at some point, we know that the Bible turns our attention to Mary, who's at the house, she's mourning. And in the biblical world, it was very customary that like a mourning season and when somebody died was very loud. Now, that's so different for us. Like when you think of being in a funeral, in a place where somebody's passing, or a hospital room, it's often quiet. In the ancient world, it was very loud. It was something that was big. And, people sometimes paid other people to be part of the mourning ceremony that they had. And at one point, Mary decides that she's going to run and leave her home, and she's going to go meet with Jesus, and she's going to say something to him. And let's be honest, if you're Mary and Martha, aren't you a little bit upset? Aren't you a little bit upset that Jesus, who's healed all kinds of other people, has not come to heal Lazarus? I would be upset. Maybe you're upset right now because you've prayed and you've wondered at the times that you asked Jesus to heal someone that you love, and something else happened, and now they're getting worse, or maybe even worse than that, they're gone. It's beautiful that the Bible leaves us this story. This moment where Jesus is going to now talk with Martha and talk with Mary and give them this new perspective that death maybe is not the end. And that even for Lazarus, maybe there's something that is coming that is more beautiful than they even understand. That maybe with Jesus, there's something even more beautiful than being healed. And that is by having a new perspective on death that has to do with the resurrection life that is available because of the teachings of Jesus. Now, at one point, Mary rushes off and she gets to Jesus, and this is what she says. When Jesus, who had been with Mary in the house, comforted her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforted her, noticed how quickly she got up, they went out and they followed her. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I mean, wow. You feel just the weight of that question. Like, we know that you are the one who has the power to heal other people. We've seen you heal other people. And now you delayed, and for some reason we don't understand this. We know that if you would have been here, we would not have to deal with this question that we just can't shake. That Lazarus is gone. I think about the weight of that, the pain of that. It actually brings us face to face with something that is always there when we think about the question of death, and that's grief. That grief and suffering, and not only saying goodbye to those that we love, but what do we do for those of us who have to stay here and sit in a home that is quiet, and in a weird way, we wonder, like, where are the ones that we love, and what does it mean to get through life and begin life again? I've been a pastor for a long time, and let me just tell you that never gets easy. It never gets easy to sit down with people who've lost a loved one, who are thinking about what is the next day gonna look like, or the next week. Can I just encourage you to remember that as you think about this question, or the questions that come with death that you just can't shake, none of us were created to go through those moments by ourselves. None of us. This is why in some way, even though Lazarus is gone, Jesus makes his way to Martha and Mary, and he begins to be with them and lead them and provide this new perspective on suffering and pain. It's almost like Jesus knows that even though healing is available, there is a kind of power and presence that is available for those who are grieving even when someone has died. Now, we live in a world where technology is going to make this so much more beneficial for us in some ways and more complicated for us in other ways. There's actually new words that we're inventing as we think about how we say goodbye to people, and how technology is now making it possible for us to feel like that maybe we never have to grieve or say goodbye to people. There's actually research now saying that new AI technology is allow us to continue to talk to people who passed using AI technology to keep them alive in some sense in our social media feeds, in our communication online. One article that I read, and you'll see this, talks about this as grief bots and death bots. AI-generated voice and video avatars trained on the data of a deceased person is a booming digital afterlife industry. You heard that right. There's now a booming digital afterlife industry. That soon we will have to deal with what it means that when we're experiencing the fear, the confusion of death, instead of stepping into moments of grief that are healthy and important for healing, we have an option to delay that grief, to delay those moments that are maybe very important to us, and to maybe minimize the grief by continuing to use technology to keep the person who is physically gone digitally alive. Let's just agree this is going to be weird. Let's just agree together that this is something Jesus never had to deal with, but it's something that we have to deal with. And it's something that is going to require incredible wisdom and patience and learning to think about what it means that because we're not sure what we think about death, when grief meets us in those painful moments, we will try to run away from it and use technology to lessen the grief instead of stepping into the grief to experience the kind of wisdom that only comes sometimes when we stare death and grief and our limitations in the face. I don't know about you, and I don't know what I would do in those moments. I wish I could give you the answers and the 5 easy steps of what to do when you're invited to deal with a death bot or a grief bot. But this is something, again, that I think is so important for us to wrestle with. And it's so important because I think the Bible wrestles with the fact that Jesus, in this story, doesn't just minimize death or bypass it, but lets Lazarus die. And then enters the story in a moment of grief, deep grief. A deep moment of sadness and pain and confusion and yelling and noise and people wondering, and Mary saying to Jesus, if you would have been here, all the grief and pain we would never have to have experienced. And maybe Jesus wants us to hear what he's doing in this story. And that is to say to her, there's something about grief and pain that we're always meant to feel, because death is never meant to feel natural. It's meant to feel like a violation. It's meant to feel like a deep moment of grief and pain. The reason that I think grief can be such a powerful spiritual thing that God uses, although it's not something that God intended for us at the beginning of creation, is because it teaches us to be the kinds of people that can sit with others who are grieving. That we can walk along other people who are maybe not dying, but they're in a dark place and a difficult place. They're wrestling with all kinds of questions they just can't shake, and they feel all alone. And because I or you have been through a season of grief, we can sit with them and we can talk with them and we can say something with such authenticity to say, I really know what it feels like to be you now. That Jesus now in this moment doesn't tell us everything about why he delays, but he's going to do something very, very profound. He's going to begin to walk with Mary and Martha back to the house where Lazarus is, back to the tomb, probably where they buried him now a few days ago. And this is what we're told happens. It's very profound. It says he was deeply moved. Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. That Jesus weeps in this moment, that he could have avoided and he could have gone and healed Lazarus before he died, is mind-blowing to me. It's mind-blowing because the Bible wants us to know that even the one who has power over death does not minimize moments where weeping is essential. Where weeping and grief are part of what it means to be human. And it's part of in those moments that a particular kind of wisdom is available to us. And that Jesus himself does not bypass this. Now, you know what's really crazy about this? If you're new to the Bible and new to the story, I want to encourage you to read the whole story because it's beautiful, is you might not know this. But Jesus is weeping even though in a few moments in the story, Jesus is going to raise Lazarus back to life. It's always strange to me. Why would Jesus be weeping if he knows in a few minutes there's going to be complete joy for everyone? Why doesn't he do something that I would do? I would say something like, wait and see, guys, I'm going to do something amazing soon. Why doesn't he do that? He doesn't just bypass, the real humanity of grief and pain and suffering. He doesn't bypass the fact that although he's going to do something special that's going to bring Lazarus back to life, that one day Lazarus will die again. Just remember that. Remember that principle that even though Jesus heals people in the Bible, the people that he heals one day will die. That healing and the joy of healing and even the joy of getting better when we're sick doesn't eliminate the question we just cannot shake. That death is still very real. And that we can either take our cues from our culture or we can take our cues from the Bible that says to us that God, if we can just number our days and be wise in that, you can teach us so many things about what it means to be human and what it means to walk with other people who are going through deep pain in this life. In some ways, what Jesus wants them to learn, and I think it's something he wants us to learn, is that our fear of death is not something that we should try to numb, but it's something that we should try to learn from so that we can learn what it means to be near to others when they're experiencing sickness and grief and maybe death as well. In this beautiful story, Jesus is going to go with them, and as he's weeping, he's going to do the unimaginable. He's going to do something that people will talk about for years to come, that the Gospel of John records for us, that Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. A most amazing miracle, a most profound miracle. Like I said, it's such an amazing miracle that we know that the community is going to be overjoyed. This is going to be amazing. We're wondering why Jesus didn't do this sooner. That's an incredible thing. But Lazarus will eventually die again. He will. And maybe Jesus delays to prepare Mary and Martha and those who read the story now, that grief might be delayed, but grief is coming for them. Like it comes for all of us. And that grief and dying can have a different perspective when we believe what Jesus says in the story, that he is the resurrection and the life. And that those who believe in him don't only hope for the resurrection and the hope of new life one day when we die, but we can live in the truth of the resurrection now as those who can face death and grief and suffering in this world in such a way that we know that there's resurrection hope and meaning and wisdom, even as we look at something as difficult as death. I'm not sure how you are working through this out in your own life, and I'm not even sure if just one sermon on this topic is going to help you. As I was preparing, I said to Jeff and VJ and just some of the leaders that I was talking to at our church, I feel like this can be like 4 or 5 weeks, but just think about talking about death for 4 or 5 weeks. We'd be turning YouTube off so fast because we have no category for living in this space for too long. But I hope you're still with me as we wrap up. I hope you're still with me as we just tie a bow on this to remember that there's something about the way the Bible presents death that is not the end of our life, but the possibility of the beginning of a new chapter of who we're meant to be. And death is not just something we get to run away from, but there's a wisdom that is available to us when we don't waste our life being afraid or paralyzed by death, but welcoming the wisdom of what it means to focus on the right things with the time that we have now. And that if we're not careful, we can miss all of the wisdom that is available to us because we're so afraid of what death is and what suffering might be and what pain is waiting for us. And that Jesus, in this profound funeral ceremony, does some incredible teaching that is meant to help us in our own moments of grief when we think about this question we just can't shake, this question of dying. You know, there's a person in the biblical world when Jesus is around. His name is Herod. His name is Herod the Great, and he's actually the ruler in charge when Jesus is born. And he is one of the most powerful, wealthy, networked, successful rulers the Romans could have ever had, ruling in the region where Jesus is. He's such an effective and horrible ruler, right, that the Romans call him Herod the Great. He just knows how to contain things and murder the right people and take advantage of the right people. And Herod is realizing that at some point in his life, he's going to die. And he's so paranoid about dying that all the money in the world and all the success in the world, he just can't shake that one day he's going to die. Archaeologists have uncovered the place that Herod built for his funeral. It's called the Herodium. The Herodium is this burial site at the top of a mountain that Herod spent years just funding and building so that when he dies, his body could rest on this Herodium as a celebration of his life. And every time he thought about death, he wanted to just remind people how amazing he was, and he wanted people to know that he would be buried on this site. And what's fascinating about Herod is that all the money in the world, all the power in the world, all the networks in the world could not keep him from this fear of that one day he too would die. There's an ancient historian, his name is Josephus. He tells us that when Herod thinks about the day that he's going to die, he's so paranoid that nobody's going to care that he's dead. And he's so paranoid that everybody's actually going to celebrate that he's dead, that he actually does the unimaginable. He actually puts this plan in place to tell some of the people who work for him to kill random people on the same day that he dies. I said that right. He plans a certain dying of different people in the community that would die on the exact day that he would die, so people would mourn in the communities, so that people would mourn. It would look like they're mourning him while they're mourning their own loved ones. That Herod is so paranoid about being forgotten that he actually wants other people to die on the day that he dies. This person is recorded his life in the Bible. And we have examples of people in the Bible that although they would have been able to rethink their views on death, they continue to hold on to their own views of death. And Herod represents somebody who not only is afraid to die, but he's paranoid of being forgotten. He's paranoid of being forgotten if people just ignore his life and actually are so happy that he's gone. Maybe for you, as you think about death, you feel like all kinds of strands of ideas that are linked to that. Maybe it's pain, maybe it's grief, maybe it's suffering, but maybe for you, it's just the fear of being forgotten. That your life didn't count for something greater than just making money or being successful or just doing what you're doing. And Jesus this morning is saying to you and to me that those who believe in his teachings and those who believe in what he came to do can listen to him and can welcome him as the one who truly is the one who is the resurrection and the life. Before I pray, I'm just going to leave you with one last thing that the Bible tells us about Jesus. And this is what it says. Jesus says this about himself: I am the living one. I died, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and of the grave. These are words recorded in the last book of the Bible about Jesus himself. That in stepping into that tomb and in dying, he not only died to break the curse of sin, but he died to break the curse of death. And that curse of death is not only broken one day when we die, when we're old. It's broken now while we're still alive and young and able to live lives that honor Jesus, the living one. And so this morning, wherever you're watching this, I just pray that this encourages you to not be afraid to think about the importance of death, and to realize that maybe we're not meant to shake the reality of death, the way our culture is trying to do that. Let me just pray for us before we close. God, we thank you for the mystery of your Spirit's strength and power with us in moments when we wrestle with all kinds of questions. Questions that remind us of our limitations, questions that remind us of answers we have, questions we have where answers are not easy to find. I think about people who are listening to this who are feeling just the grief and the suffering of having to say goodbye to those that they love. Thinking about death is never easy, but today maybe we're learning that it's not meant to be, because death is so unnatural, because it's not the way things are supposed to be. Today, for anyone who's listening to this, who is hearing about Jesus and the resurrection life that he offers, I pray you would nudge us, prompt us to respond to this in a way that moves us closer to the things that Jesus said, so that we can begin to live with a perspective about a resurrection life that is available to us now. I pray that as we continue to learn about these kinds of topics, as we continue to walk with other people, you would make us the kinds of people who are wise as we sit with others who are grieving, and as we look forward to the day of great hope when we will meet you again in the resurrection life. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.